In 1870, a 31-year-old in Cleveland, Ohio, controlled roughly 4% of America's oil refining. 10 years later, he effectively owned the industry's throat, sitting at about 90%. By 1904, his influence extended far beyond refineries because he shaped production, pricing, transport, and final distribution so thoroughly that rivals could barely breathe without his permission. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and the most important thing he left behind was not simply Standard Oil as a company, but Standard Oil as a method. When the Supreme Court broke the corporation apart in 1911, the name was dismantled, yet the underlying machinery survived, adapted, and became the default operating system for corporate power. If you're into money and investing, subscribe and support this video with a like. Now, let's continue. The argument is not that you live inside Standard Oil in 2025, because you obviously do not. The claim is that you live inside the template Rockefeller engineered, and that template was copied so widely it now hides in plain sight. The fuel you put in your car, the medicines you're prescribed, the search engines and platforms you use, the shipping networks that move consumer goods, and the banking structures that decide how money flows all echo the same set of principles once you know what to look for. Those principles are not mysterious, but they are exceptionally effective. Control the supply chain from end to end, reduce competitors until only a few remain, shape the rules that are supposed to restrain you, and purchase public legitimacy through philanthropy that also preserves wealth. Rockefeller's true legacy is that this pattern can be repeated in almost any sector because the goal is not oil, the goal is control. That is why this story frames Rockefeller less as a historical figure and more as a designer of modern extraction. The system can look helpful on the surface because it often delivers lower prices and smoother service, but its deeper function is to concentrate ownership and decision-making in fewer hands over time. Once that concentration is achieved, the consumer's choices become cosmetic, because most paths lead back to the same small group of dominant firms. The reason it matters is not academic curiosity, but pattern recognition, because when you can name the pattern, you stop being surprised by how often it reappears. To see the mechanics clearly, you have to watch Rockefeller build the machine, watch him use it to become the defining fortune of modern capitalism, watch the breakup that supposedly punished him make him even richer, and then watch the blueprint spread into other industries until it became normal. John Davidson Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, into a family with two energies that would later fuse inside his business personality. His father drifted through schemes and deception, selling fake cures and performing small cons that rewarded nerve and detachment. His mother, in sharp contrast, was a strict Baptist who preached discipline, order, and moral certainty. The narrative suggests Rockefeller absorbed both influences and turned them into a single operating philosophy. He could be utterly ruthless in practice, while sincerely believing his ruthlessness served a higher purpose. He did not always see monopoly as a moral contradiction, because he convinced himself that consolidation created efficiency, and efficiency was a form of social improvement. That inner certainty is a major part of why he could crush livelihoods and still feel like the good guy. When oil was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, the United States entered a strange new rush. Prospectors flooded into the region, drilling became feverish, fortunes appeared and vanished, and prices swung violently with every wave of overproduction and shortage. Many people saw the chance to get rich by striking crude, but Rockefeller, still young and working in Cleveland, saw a different kind of opportunity. Drilling looked like gambling because it depended on geology and luck, and even a productive well could become unprofitable when prices collapsed. Refining, by comparison, looked like the boring middle step that everyone needed and no one could avoid, because crude oil only became useful at scale when it was processed into kerosene and other products. Rockefeller chose the choke point instead of the lottery, and that single choice shaped everything that followed. In 1863, he put roughly $4,000 into his first refinery in Cleveland, and within a couple of years, it became the city's largest. That might sound like dominance, yet Cleveland had dozens of refineries, and the industry operated on thin margins where many businesses hovered near insolvency. Rockefeller's advantage was not simply that he worked harder, because many competitors worked desperately hard. His advantage was that he aimed to change the structure of the market so competitors could not survive as independent organisms. Instead of trying to be the best refiner in a crowded field, he intended to turn refining into a coordinated system where the field itself shrank until only his organization remained. The first structural weapon was vertical integration, a phrase that sounds technical but describes something very concrete. Most refiners refined and nothing more, meaning they purchased crude from drillers, bought barrels from barrel makers, paid railroads for shipment, rented storage space, and relied on distributors to reach customers. Every one of those steps generated profit for someone else, and every one of those steps made the refiner dependent on outside terms. Rockefeller treated dependence as a cost and a vulnerability, so he began pulling the surrounding businesses into his own orbit. He moved into barrel production, so packaging would not be dictated by someone else's prices. He invested in tank cars and transport capacity so he could negotiate from strength. He built storage and warehousing so he could control timing, and he expanded distribution so profits at the final step could be captured rather than shared. This integration produced an effect that looked like efficiency and operated like predation. If Rockefeller could manufacture critical inputs cheaper than rivals could buy them, he could sell refined products at prices that rivals could not match without bleeding. If he could ship more cheaply through special arrangements, he could undercut competitors while preserving margin because his savings were structural, not temporary. Railroads were particularly important because oil that could not move might as well not exist, and Rockefeller understood transport was a leverage point. He negotiated rebates and preferential rates that reduced his costs and raised the effective costs of rivals, meaning the same rail system could function like an invisible subsidy for Standard Oil and an invisible tax on everyone else. At that point, a free market becomes a stage set, because the rules of survival are quietly tilted. By 1870, he consolidated his growing operation into the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, and at first, he still held only a minority share of national refining. He treated that as unacceptable because a partial share leaves room for opponents, and opponents create uncertainty. So, he built the second structural weapon, horizontal consolidation, the strategy of buying competitors or forcing them into failure and then buying what remains. In 1872, in a campaign later nicknamed the Cleveland Massacre, he demonstrated the method with stunning clarity. He approached refinery owners across the city, offering to purchase their facilities, often at terms that looked reasonable and sometimes with continued employment inside the Standard Oil network. The friendliness of the offer was strategic because it was paired with an unspoken threat that refusal would trigger a financial assault. When owners refused, Rockefeller initiated price wars that they could not endure. He cut prices below cost and could sustain the losses because his integrated system made him cheaper, and his reserves made him patient, while independent operators had neither cushion. They could watch cash burn with every sale until credit dried up, or they could surrender and take the buyout while anything remained to sell. The narrative's core claim is that Rockefeller made this a standard sequence. First offer purchase as a polite exit, then apply economic force until the target collapses, then acquire the remains at a discount. In roughly 3 months, he controlled almost every refinery in Cleveland, turning a citywide industry into an extension of his own machine. He did not stop at Cleveland because the logic of the system demanded national dominance. Through the 1870s, he repeated the pattern in other refining centers, extending Standard Oil into New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and beyond. The same elements kept showing up. Lower costs created by vertical integration, transport advantages created by deals, and aggressive price cutting that broke resistance. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled around 90% of America's refining capacity, a figure so large it stops being a successful company and becomes a private government over an industry. At that level, Rockefeller was not simply selling kerosene. He was dictating the conditions under which the entire market could exist. That kind of dominance triggers two predictable reactions: law and hatred. A monopoly becomes a political symbol, and a political symbol eventually becomes a legal target, because democratic systems cannot ignore public outrage forever. Rockefeller understood this, and he also understood that ownership itself could be redesigned to protect control. The solution was the trust, a legal innovation that let a small circle coordinate many companies as if they were one, even when state laws tried to prevent cross-state ownership. In 1882, his lawyers created the Standard Oil Trust, a structure that held stock in multiple Standard Oil entities and centralized decision-making in a tiny group of trustees. The critical point is that the controlling entity did not need to operate refineries. It only needed to own and direct the companies that did. This maneuver matters because it separates power from the messy visibility of production. Once the controlling structure sits above operations, it becomes harder to regulate, harder to attack, and easier to reproduce elsewhere. The narrative treats this as the ancestor of the modern holding company, the parent that owns subsidiaries, shifts assets across entities, manages liability, and complicates enforcement because the real decision-making center is insulated. Even if the brand changes, the architecture stays intact, and the architecture can be copied by other sectors that have nothing to do with oil. That is why the story insists Rockefeller's greatest invention was not a refinery, but a legal design that made large-scale control feel normal. By the early 1900s, Standard Oil's reach extended so broadly that estimates placed it at about 91% of refining and a huge share of final sales. Rockefeller's wealth rose to levels that later comparisons describe as unmatched in modern history, especially when inflation-adjusted estimates are used. Yet the backlash intensified as well, because the public increasingly saw Standard Oil as a symbol of unfair power. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 created legal tools to challenge monopolies, and investigative journalism made Rockefeller's tactics easier to understand for ordinary people. Ida Tarbell's reporting exposed the hidden machinery of rebates, predatory pricing, and coercion, and the outcry helped set the stage for the Supreme Court decision in 1911 that ordered Standard Oil broken into dozens of separate companies. On paper, that ruling looks like a moral climax where the state defeats the monopolist and restores competition. In Rockefeller's story, it became a wealth multiplier because he still owned large stakes in the separated companies. When the pieces began trading independently, investors valued them more highly than they had valued the single consolidated entity, and the combined market value of the fragments rose sharply. Successor companies later became giants, including entities that evolved into Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and others. And the narrative emphasizes that the breakup did not eliminate dominance so much as redistribute it across an oligopoly. The most uncomfortable lesson is that breaking a monopoly can create multiple powerful firms that still control their regions, and that a founder who holds shares across them can become richer after punishment than before. Over time, mergers and acquisitions pushed the descendants back toward consolidation. Exxon and Mobil merged in 1999, Chevron absorbed other regional descendants, and BP acquired major pieces tied to the original breakup, illustrating how the system can pause, rebrand, and then reconverge. The story's point is not that every merger is illegal, it is that the economic incentives of scale keep driving industries toward fewer centers of power. If the method rewards size, and if capital markets reward dominance, then dominance tends to return even after formal breakups. Standard Oil's name was split, yet the system quietly rebuilt itself, because the system is a technique, not a logo. From there, the narrative shifts to the present and insists that the most enduring legacy is the playbook, not the petroleum brands. Amazon is portrayed as a modern example of Rockefeller's logic applied to commerce. It began with a narrow product category, then expanded into warehousing, logistics, delivery infrastructure, payments, and cloud computing, until it controlled a pipeline that other businesses depend on, even when they dislike Amazon. The story highlights that Amazon Web Services is not a side hobby, but a massive engine that hosts the digital backbone of modern commerce, including services used by potential competitors. Rockefeller gained leverage by controlling transport and distribution around refining. Amazon gains leverage by controlling the physical and digital rails of retail itself. Amazon is also used as an illustration of horizontal power because it buys competitors when possible and squeezes them when purchase is not available. Acquisitions absorb new markets and capabilities, while platform control can replicate Rockefeller's price war dynamic in a modern form. Sellers reveal sales data through the marketplace. Amazon can identify what sells, launch house brand alternatives, and then promote those alternatives with algorithmic advantages and logistics benefits. Instead of a public kerosene price collapse, the modern version can be a quiet ranking shift, a preferential shipping badge, or a product placement choice that drains competitors over time. The mechanism is still recognizable. Observe the rival, undercut the rival, and use control of distribution to decide who thrives. Google is framed as a modern descendant of the trust logic because Alphabet functions as a parent that owns multiple operating companies under one strategic umbrella. This structure allows power to be centralized while risk and liability are distributed. And it also makes regulatory remedies more complicated because each subsidiary can be described as separate, even when influence is unified. The narrative adds a modern twist that Rockefeller would have appreciated. Dominance is easier to maintain when users believe a product is free. If a service is paid for with data, attention, and dependency rather than direct money, the monopoly feels less like a monopoly to the public even when market share is overwhelming. A market can be captured more completely when the payment is invisible. Pharmaceutical corporations are introduced as another arena where Rockefeller's method reappears, particularly through regulatory capture. Rockefeller did not merely defeat rivals in the open. He learned to influence the standards and rules that determine who could compete at all. The script argues that modern pharma achieves comparable control through patents, lobbying, relationships with regulators, and the shaping of professional guidelines, which can create barriers so high that smaller entrants cannot survive. When the regulated sector funds research, supplies expertise, and dominates the pipeline of approvals, regulation can drift from guarding consumers to guarding incumbents. In that framing, control over the rulebook becomes as valuable as control over production. Finance is presented as another Rockefeller echo through the holding company model. Large banks operate through layered corporate structures that separate business lines and spread risk across entities, making oversight and enforcement far more complex. After crises, regulators can struggle to define where the real control lies, because strategy may sit at the parent level, while operations sit in subsidiaries that can be rearranged or shielded. The script links this complexity back to Rockefeller's trust concept, which concentrated control while distributing visibility. A structure that makes power hard to locate also makes power hard to restrain, and that becomes part of the moat. The final and most socially powerful element is philanthropy, presented as Rockefeller's late-stage innovation. In 1913, he created the Rockefeller Foundation with an enormous gift, and on the surface it looked like charitable redemption, funding research, public health, and education. The narrative does not deny that real good can be funded, but it insists that foundations also buy legitimacy, preserve wealth, and shape policy over decades. A tax-exempt foundation can reduce estate tax impact, keep money under ideological influence, and decide which institutions receive support, which fields flourish, and which frameworks become standard. It can convert a hated monopolist into a celebrated benefactor, and public memory can shift from destroyer of competitors to builder of hospitals and universities. The story claims the foundation helped shape modern medical education by funding institutions and standards that emphasized laboratory science and pharmaceutical intervention, a model that then aligned naturally with the growth of corporate medicine. It frames this as structural influence rather than conspiracy, because funding guides research priorities guide professional norms, and norms guide markets. From there, the narrative draws a line to today's billionaire philanthropy, arguing that modern foundations and philanthropic vehicles blend real charitable activity with tax advantages, legacy construction, and policy influence at enormous scale. The Gates Foundation and similar entities are described as heirs to Rockefeller's model because they can shape agendas across global health and education while sitting outside direct democratic accountability. The innovation is not being generous, but building a parallel institution that steers society while preserving control. Rockefeller's system also outlived him through the persistence of family influence and institutional wealth. The text points to later generations, including David Rockefeller's long reign in high finance and his role in elite policy networks, to illustrate how wealth dispersed across trusts and funds can remain influential for decades. The emphasis is not simply that one family stayed rich, but that the structures Rockefeller pioneered make influence durable. When power is encoded into corporate law, holding entities, foundations, and professional institutions, it does not die when a founder dies. It persists as infrastructure, and infrastructure is harder to challenge than any single villain. At the level of everyday life, the narrative insists the system is designed to feel like freedom while functioning like containment. You buy gasoline from a small cluster of companies operating as an oligopoly that traces back, directly or indirectly, to Standard Oil's breakup or to its methods. You shop in an economy where dominant platforms have built logistics networks so powerful that competitors must either imitate them at immense cost or accept permanent disadvantage. You search for information through services whose dominance is protected by network effects and default settings, while payment is extracted through data rather than cash. You socialize through platforms that own multiple separate apps, so switching often means moving between subsidiaries under the same parent. You receive healthcare within systems shaped by licensing, reimbursement, and professional training patterns that are influenced by the same philanthropic and regulatory dynamics. To make the extraction feel tangible, the script argues that your spending on necessities becomes a stream-feeding monopolistic structures. Even when prices look low, the total lifetime flow can be enormous because the system touches fuel, retail, medicine, and finance, which are hard to opt out of without sacrificing participation in modern life. The core claim is that escape is difficult, not because you are weak-willed, but because the system is engineered so that convenience and necessity lead back to concentrated control. In this framing, your choices are real but constrained, because the architecture of the market has already been shaped by consolidation and by rules that favor incumbents. At the same time, the narrative adds an important nuance. The system's power comes partly from the fact that it is efficient. Vertical integration can genuinely reduce costs because it removes markups and smooths coordination. Consolidation can reduce duplication because fewer firms can plan production and distribution with fewer mismatches. Regulatory stability can encourage long-term investment, and philanthropic funding can produce real scientific and public health advances. Standard Oil did make kerosene far cheaper than it had been in the chaotic early industry, and modern giants do deliver fast shipping, instant information access, reliable fuel, and powerful medicines. The problem is that efficiency and extraction can coexist because consumers can receive convenience while ownership and wealth concentrate in the hands of those who control the choke points. Near the end, the story shifts from explanation to posture, suggesting that people respond in different ways once they recognize the structure. Some choose acceptance, treating consolidation as an inevitable endpoint of mature capitalism and enjoying the convenience while acknowledging the concentration. Others choose resistance, supporting antitrust enforcement, buying from smaller businesses even when it costs more, and backing political efforts that prioritize competition over frictionless efficiency. A third approach is pragmatic positioning, framed as understanding where wealth flows and refusing to remain blind to the incentives, while explicitly noting that this is pattern recognition rather than personal financial advice. Rockefeller understood that the most powerful position was owning the infrastructure that everyone else must use, because the toll is collected quietly and repeatedly. The conclusion returns to Rockefeller's worldview through the famous phrase, "Competition is a sin." The narrative treats that line not as a joke, but as a serious moral statement about waste and efficiency, because Rockefeller believed competition duplicated effort, destroyed capital, and produced chaos. In his mind, consolidation created order, and order justified dominance because it delivered lower prices and predictable supply. The story argues that the modern economy has moved toward that same endpoint, where 3 to 5 dominant players often control each major sector. Barriers to entry rise over time, and the system becomes harder to challenge because it is embedded in law, regulation, and institutional culture. Standard Oil was broken up, but Rockefeller's method became more durable precisely because it escaped the boundaries of one company. Once it was copied widely enough, it stopped being a historical event and became the normal shape of corporate power, which is why the narrative insists you do not live in the world of Standard Oil, but in the world of Rockefeller's template.